Hey everyone, this is Jen and you are watching BPD Woman. On this channel, I talk about how to manage your borderline personality disorder using a variety of DBT techniques, sharing with you my own personal experience, and offering you methods and techniques to better help you manage your BPD, live a more effective life, and accomplish your goals in relationships, love, career, whatever they may be, in the most effective manner possible. On this channel, all are welcome. Primarily, I speak to those of us with BPD, but absolutely, I also produce content and appeal to those who are family members, loved ones of those with BPD, and also for those who just want to know a little bit more. I am not a doctor, not a therapist, not a PhD. However, I am someone who can answer the following question that most of those folks cannot, which is, what is it like to live with borderline personality disorder? So thank you for tuning back in. If all of this sounds good to you, hit subscribe below and click the bell so that you never miss a beat. I produce lots of content each week, usually uploading anywhere between 3 and 5 videos. So if you don't want to miss one, please click the bell. All right, let's get right into it. So again, my name is Jen. This is BPD Woman. I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder about 20 years ago. Since then, I have really taken a strong approach and desire to my own recovery and knowing and understanding everything about borderline personality disorder. My main goals of recovery are to decrease my emotional ability, or what is more commonly known as the emotional roller coaster or the frequent fluctuation of emotions. And primarily, I would like to focus in on improving my relationships with people. That's something that's important to me. I have gone through multiple rounds of DBT. I have read every book. I have the workbook. I've read every important study. So I do believe that I know quite a bit, and I hope that you find it valuable to your quest, whatever that may be. Today, let's dive right into our topic. So today's video, it's going to be a little bit controversial. Does that sound good? Good. Tune in. So controversy is good. Discussion is good. So usually controversy is good, unless you're waiting on an election result, right? So it's like, when is it going to be over? Anyway, today's topic is how you really got BPD. Understanding common thoughts on why BPD develops and debunking them. And I will be putting up a lot of, looking here at some of my notes on my computer. I'm going to be reading some sound bites and some studies, clips from some studies to kind of talk about where I want to lead our discussion today. You'll also see them posted as screenshots here in our video. And feel free to read the entire studies or the entire articles. Again, I'm only, we're going to keep this video to about 20 or 25 minutes. So please do continue to read more if you like. So I'm going to break this down in 3 different main sections. I want to talk about a little bit how normal personalities develop, what experts, clinicians, psychologists, child development specialists have to say about where they think personality develops and how it develops. And then I'm going to talk about how experts explain why BPD develops. And I'm sure you could probably apply this to other personality disorders. But primarily, I'm going to focus just on what experts say about how BPD develops. And then I'm going to a third part. So the first two will kind of be fact-based, what experts say, and then I'm going to weigh in on my personal beliefs, what I've seen out of the last 20 years. I hope you find what I have to say credible. I have lived with the disorder, so I feel that's a bit of a leg up on researchers. Like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm not a PhD, but let's dive into it. So I'm going to pull up some studies here. I'm pulling my sources today from reliable, vetted, educated sites that are written by experts in their field. So you're going to see information posted here from the National Health Service of the United Kingdom. You're going to see things posted here from verywell.com. You're going to see information that I have posted from the Mayo Clinic and the Children's Home Center, things of this nature. So let's get kind of right into what the main theories are about where BPD comes from, okay? And then we'll talk about how regular, it's a loaded word, regular, non-borderline personality develops, how that develops. So, I'll read a quote here, and I'll put it. Genetic factors and negative environmental influences from childhood are the primary causes of BPD, and it is highly unlikely that a person will develop borderline personality disorder if one of the other of these factors is lacking. Well, gee, isn't that all of us? We're all exposed to genetic factors and we're all exposed to environmental factors. Okay. The NHS of the United Kingdom says there is no single cause of borderline personality disorder. They list genetics, problems with brain chemicals, environmental factors. We're going to get to this. I'm really going to focus in on this chat today on environmental factors. Here is what, if you go ahead and just Google, how does a personality disorder develop? You are going to generally get keywords like trauma, abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. You will get search results that say they are predisposed to being highly sensitive. You will get that it's passed down from parent to child. You will get that twins share the same genetic factors. There's also now studies out there that say there is a mutation of chromosome 9. And that's all well and good. But think about for a moment where personality comes from, right? Of course, we have genetics and we have environment, or what people call nature and nurture, right? You have what's been inherited, what's in your blood, what's in your organs. Will you get, are you predisposed to breast cancer? Are you predisposed to, getting lupus? Does that run in your family? And then you have environmental factors like, what were your caretakers like? Were they present? Were they abusive? Were they understanding? Were they validating? Were they not validating? The problem with trying, in my opinion, to explain away personality disorders, primarily borderline personality disorders, by saying that it is a genetic inheritance, is that personality is not chemical, right? I understand, there's mood disorders and there's personality disorders. A mood disorder is something like bipolar, major depressive disorder. That's a chemical imbalance within the brain that can be usually, hopefully treated with medicines. Serotonin, SSRIs, serotonin uptake. So your Zoloft, your Prozac, right? That's how those kinds of disorders are treated. Personality disorders, if you Google medicines for BPD, generally the first search is going to come up. There are no medicines that are prescribed to treat borderline personality disorder. And that's because there's nothing chemical going on in your brain with borderline personality disorder. It's your maladaptive behaviors, the way that you have maladaptively been taught how to interact with other people, interpret your situations based on whether you grew up in an environment that you could trust and wasn't abusive, or where you constantly lived in fear and were hypervigilant. The key to helping ease borderline symptoms, or, curing it, putting borderline in remission, however you want to name your recovery, is through dialectical behavior therapy. Behavior therapy, underlined behavior therapy, right? Now, it is very rare that a person will suffer from one ailment, right? So we've talked about, I'll put up a link here. We've talked about comorbid symptoms occupying the same person. So what does that mean? So it is very uncommon for someone just to suffer from depression, or someone just to suffer from borderline personality disorder, or someone to just suffer from an eating disorder. Normally, one or more of those things are occurring at the same time. So for me, I have primarily had BPD, but I've also had eating disorders. I've had depression, and I've also had depression that has been brought on by environmental factors that I've chosen, like alcohol, cigarettes, things that we know literally depress the body. So you will see that people with BPD or other personality disorders are on some kind of medicine. For me, I'm on a low dose antidepressant, but that is not to treat my borderline, right? We can treat the depression, which will help ease us out of maladaptive behaviors by enabling us to not kind of be so down in the dumps that we are able to think more clearly and act more cognitively and proceed more effectively. So I'm going to read a quote here, how personality develops. This is just something I typed in. How does personality develop in children? This is what I Googled. Personality is formed by ongoing interaction of temperament, character, and environment. Socialization, the process by which new members of a social group are integrated in the group. Temperament, being a person's natural disposition or inborn combination of mental and emotional traits. Okay, so 2 key words. Socialization, they're talking about your environment, who you're with, what you're exposed to. And temperament, are you more sensitive? Are you normally more calm? These are things that they say, babies are just kind of born this way. There is a lot of discussion that, at least from the Marsha Linehan world and the DBT world, you'll find in the DBT literatures that they believe that borderline personality disorder comes from a bunch of trauma, essentially, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, traumatic events that have occurred over an invalidating environment that have gone on for a really long time. And in addition to, plus sign, also that they are normally a very sensitive person, or, they're prone to crying, or they, just as a child, they seem to be more into dance, or, perhaps you have, a child who is naturally drawn to taking care of animals. This is what they're talking about with temperament. The problem that, I tend to agree with what they're saying here in this description, and I also agree with Marsha Linehan and the DBT literature about where they now believe these BPD develops. However, when you are doing an extensive search on how do personalities develop in children, and talking about the different phases of development, and how to instill your child with things like confidence and problem-solving skills, communication skills, put a link below if I'm wrong, but I just don't see many articles that explain a non-personality disorder childhood development by talking a lot about genetics. They talk about things like, how well a child is socialized with others. They talk about, how well a child's needs are met. They talk about, like Erickson's like hierarchy of needs, right? Or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, excuse me. Or Erickson's development of childhood. You don't hear a lot about the genetics that play into a non-borderline personality's development. So when I start reading literature that begins to explain that borderline is caused by genetics and also environment, I have a bit of a problem with that. I just simply don't believe that I inherited by a genetic, a chromosome, a bloodline, a personality disorder. What I do believe that I inherited was a sustained pattern of learned behaviors from two very maladaptive, toxic people, my parents. You learn what you see, right? Your experiences are based on what you've been exposed to. If you know how to play a piano, then the way you know how to play that piano is, yes, it's a combination of talent, but primarily it's a combination of talent and training, but primarily it's, how well was your teacher? How good was your teacher? How disciplined were they? How often did they help you practice? How often did they encourage you? I'm sure if they encouraged you to practice every day, were supportive, propped you up when you were feeling down, I bet you became a really great piano player. And on the flip side, I bet if, your piano teacher or mom or dad only showed up whenever they wanted, sometimes slammed your fingers in the keyboard, or yelled at you when you made a mistake or told you that you were a failure, I bet you had a real trouble learning how to play the piano, right? And the same is true with personality. I have shared my story before. I grew up as an only child in a completely volatile environment where my father was narcissistic, and I don't just use narcissism or narcissistic personality disorder lightly. The things that I witnessed this man do, literally trying to kill my mother, beating me, living in a constant state of fear, being exposed to his sexual inappropriateness, his innuendos, and his misogyny, coupled with my mother's inability to choose a stable, loving partner who abused her, which led to her continued drug abuse, her affairs, her emotional dysregulated episodes, her frequent hospitalizations. And guess what? Guess where my mother learned how to choose a partner? From her family life. Guess what her father was like? Abusive. He beat the children. He sexually abused them. Guess what the mother did? Not much. And I would imagine that if I went to my great-great-parents or my great-grandparents, we would see the same dynamic. The point being that I believe that when people begin explaining BPD as genetics, what they're failing to realize is that it's learned behaviors, and that personality disorders are maladaptive behaviors. You have learned maladaptive behaviors. It's not because you're incurable. It's not because, you have a genetic mutation of like chromosome 4, whatever. Now, if there's a study that's produced at some point that took, a child, like 1 day old, took a child that, had two diagnosed borderline personality disorder parents, and then was shipped off, never interacted with her parents, was adopted out, and then 20 years later developed BPD, I would be interested to know more about that. Suffice to say that her adoptive parents weren't also borderline or suffering from a mental illness. Now, of course, child development is very complex. There are studies that show that from conception, we hear our mother's voice. We get a sense of what's going on. We can feel if it's a safe environment in the womb, or, we develop, our genetic or our emotional dispositions of fear or happiness or contentment or safety based on being in our mother's womb. I can hear people in the apartment next to me. Are you telling me that I couldn't hear my mother from her own, from a foot above? I could hear her, I'm sure. I can't remember. Now, so that's my main argument, that genetic dispositions are generally, in my opinion, sold off to people as being something you can't change, like a defect in your chromosome, when in fact, personality disorders by nature are maladaptive behaviors. You have learned to have this disorder. You have learned to have maladaptive behaviors. It wasn't just sealed, signed, and delivered when you were conceived. I'm sorry, I just don't agree with that. Here's a story. It's a little anecdote. A young girl was watching her mother prepare Thanksgiving dinner, and she was prepping the turkey, gonna bake the turkey in the oven. And the turkey was huge, it was 20 pounds. But the mother had this really small pan that really didn't fit the turkey, and she was putting it in the oven. But the child never really questioned that. Later, when the child got older, she asked her mother, well, why did you use a small pan for a large turkey when we were growing up? Why did you never use an appropriate sized pan? So the mother thought about it, went to ask her mother. The mother said, well, I always used a small pan because that's what my mother taught me. So then they go to their great-grandmother and they said, great-grandmother, why have you taught us to bake a large turkey in a small pan? And she said, because that's the only size pan I had at the time. Right? Do you get it? It's not that the great-grandma didn't know to cook a turkey in a larger pan. Of course she knew that. That would be common sense. It just happened to be that that's the only pan that she had. And then her child picked up on that, and her child picked up on that, and so on and so forth. Okay, I think I've made my point. So let's talk about some of the literature that's out there, some of the studies, some of the thoughts. I'll just go through some of these. So bear with me as I scroll through some of these. Okay. NHS says the following. It says genetics, problem with brain chemicals. Thought that people with BPD have something wrong with the neurotransmitters in their brain, particularly serotonin. Again, serotonin is the feel-good drug or the feel-good chemical that your body makes. If you don't get enough, you feel depressed. But again, people with BPD just don't have BPD. They have depression. They have eating disorders. They have substance abuse problems. So altered levels of serotonin may have linked to depression, aggression, and difficulty urging destructive urges. Agreed. Okay. Problems with brain development. Researchers have used MRI to study the brains of people with BPD. Okay. Basically, it says they looked at the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the orbitofrontal cortex. Problems with these brains may well contribute to symptoms of BPD. Yes, and when does your brain develop? Right? When is your brain most susceptible to learning? When do things like that set in? It's generally before the age of 3 or 4. It goes on to say the development of these parts of the brain are affected by your early upbringing. Yep. Now, the largest section on the NHS website to try to explain where BPD comes from says the following. A number of environmental factors seem to be common and widespread through those with BPD. They include being the victim of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, being exposed to long-term fear or distress, check, check. Being neglected by one or both parents, yes, yes. And listen, that could be physical, emotional, or spiritual. They may physically live in your house but never talk to you, right? They could be living in the house, physically be present, but be abusing you. Growing up with another family member who had a serious mental health condition or a drink or drug misuse problem, yes, that's where you learn it. A person's relationship with their parents and family has a strong influence on how they come to see the world and what they believe about other people. I would go further to say strong. I would say primary. Primary. Unresolved fear, anger, and distress from childhood can lead to a variety of distorted adult thinking patterns, idealizing others, expecting others to be a parent to you, expecting other people to bully you, behaving as if other people are adults and you're not. That's interesting, right? Because I think those of us with BPD often think that other people have the answers and that we don't know. I mean, at least I know that I do. Like, everyone knows how to be like, an emotional functioning adult with financial stability and that make good relationship choices, and it's just me that doesn't. That's interesting. The Children's Home Sinti.org published a article February of 2018 talking about neurological research proves that most children actually begin to learn even before they're born. Hence, how can they recognize their mother's voice or else know a 2-month-old baby if his mother is there or not? Interesting. The first 3 years of a child's life are known to be the most accelerated brain growth, with more than 1 million correlations forming every second. Therefore, the early development of children is being heavily emphasized on these. Children are known to be learners and adapters from the very beginning. Initially, they learn by observing, then imitating, and later by retaining informations and performing actions. I mean, could you write it any better? That's where personality comes from. That's how they describe personality coming from. So why wouldn't we describe having a personality disorder the same way if all we're really talking about is behaviors and recognizing certain people and situations? Went to the ScienceDaily.com. The University of Missouri-Columbia published a study. It's an old study, 12 years ago. The summary of the study was, scientists have found that genetic material on chromosome 9 was linked to BPD features, a disorder characterized by, okay, you can read the rest. It just basically says that in a new study, collaborators found that genetic material on chromosome 9 was linked to BPD features. I tried reading more of that information, more of those studies, and feel free to do the same. It was pretty dense. It was a little bit hard for me to understand. So I'm really not prepared to offer much of an opinion about that. Went to the Mayo Clinic. Now they talk about the risk factors associated with personality development, including the risk of developing BPD. They include hereditary disposition. You may be at a higher risk if a close relative, your mother, brother, father, sister, has the same or a similar disorder. Why? I don't believe that's hereditary. Again, I believe that's learned behaviors. If you come from a family of mechanics and they've all taught each other how to be a mechanic and you learn how to be a mechanic, was that hereditary or was that learned behavior? Just saying. Stressful childhood. Many people with the disorder report being sexually, physically abused, neglected. Duh. Okay, sorry, not to be flip. In studies on the genetic links, like true genetics, like chromosomes, the National Institutes of Health published this study here, and it said, to our knowledge, this is the first linkage of BPD features that on chromosome 9 is the richest candidate for genes influencing BPD. The results of this study will move the field closer to determining the genetic etiology of BPD. What they're basically saying is that this is one of the very first studies of its kind. We don't really know much about it, and therefore the research is in its infancy, meaning they don't really have a clear picture. I mean, think about the first time they discovered HIV, the very first time in 1984, I believe it was. Do you think they knew everything that they know now about HIV back then? What if they took only what they knew about HIV in 1984 and that's all we ever knew about it? You know, there was no further research, there's no further studies or development, there was no further case studies. We would have a very narrow 30-year-old view, 40-year-old view of what HIV looked like. But today, we have decades and decades of research and, charts and so much information. The point being that it's really just too early to say where BPD comes from on chromosome 9, if at all. Anyway, to summarize again, I don't really believe that genetics plays a huge factor in a personality disorder. Of course, those of us inherit chemical disorders, low serotonin, imbalances in the brain. Sure, I understand that. And I also understand that you have comorbid disorders such as depression, substance abuse, BPD, all in one. Substance abuse is kind of a different animal. I can do a separate video on that. But for me, I didn't, I abused drugs and alcohol for a really long time. Why did I do that? Because I was easing my pain. I was trying to treat something. I was trying to calm myself down. I was trying to act differently in situations. When I replaced all of those really detrimental substances with more effective behaviors, I stopped becoming an addict. I went to AA, I did all that. It didn't work. You abuse those things, in my opinion, because you are trying to find a different way to cope, right? And the way that I was coping with those substances wasn't healthy. I have yet to meet somebody with BPD that did not come from a really traumatic environment. And I mean a sustained, long, traumatic environment of abuse, of invalidation, somebody who lived, in fear. You will see a lot of forums out there. People are like, rubbish, it didn't come from their parents, No, it didn't. Check out other people's YouTube channels or comments or, check out forums. The people that are pushing and saying the hardest that, parents didn't contribute or cause their child's personality disorder is pure rubbish. They're just guilty. They're just guilty and they don't want to accept it, or they're in denial and they have their own problems and they'll never come to the truth about it. But if the same child, if they were in a different position and the child grew up super successful, their personality was wonderful, do you think that the parent would take responsibility then? Do you think they would say, that's because of my great parenting? Yeah, probably. Listen, let me hear what you think. Personality versus chemical disorders. Personality is learned. Chemical is genetic. Chemical is inherited. However, there's nothing truly proven just yet about the genetics, the true genetics of BPD. Let me hear what your thoughts are. Thanks for tuning in. There is hope for getting recovered from BPD. There is hope in changing your behaviors. You can change them. And if you do have BPD, congratulations, because you have one of the most well-researched, well-versed personality disorders that exist. You have more books available to you. You have a true and tried modality of therapy, DBT. You have more people that know about BPD than ever before. So for that, I think there is something to be grateful for. People with BPD are great people, and you are too. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you next time. Bye.